This black-capped chickadee is the star of the show for this multi-part, slow-stitched project. Join me today as I create a chickadee using a template, attach it to a fabric collage, and stitch its feathers. After stitching the background, I answer the question, what do I do with it? By transforming the stitching into wearable art, where I add backing, a kilt pin, and a stitched border. So pull up a chair and stitch along. Let's get started. I have a piece of felt that is about 3 1/4 by 3 1/4 inches square. I'm also using embroidery needles, and I'm using 2 strands of embroidery floss throughout this project. I'm going to make a simple collage of 3 fabrics, and I'm going to secure them in place using regular sewing thread. I'm using the Friction heat erasable pens and my Chickadee template, and a link to purchase that is in the description. And I'm using the Friction pens to trace the chickadee onto fabric 3 different times. So here's my collage. I have 3 strips of fabric, a green with gold dots, a piece of burgundy fabric, and a piece of sari silk on top that is coral and light blue. And I've secured these pieces down with sewing thread. And now I'm thinking about the bird that I want to put in front of this background. I'm using this chickadee today, which is from my set that has birds and a butterfly and a fish. I think that bird would fit very nicely onto this collage. So I've taken this template, I've traced it onto this fabric, and I'm going to cut it out. And I'm going to build the colors of my bird from there. So I've cut a second one in a dark color. This is kind of a mottled green, black color. And I've drawn on this one the markings that I want. And the parts that I want to be this dark color, I'm going to cut away. So I'm using the lines that I've drawn as a guide, and I'm cutting out that area under his beak where his throat is, because I want that black to show through. And then I'm going to move over to the bird's head, and I'm going to remove that top part of the bird's head. I'm going to leave the little eye there, and I'm going to follow those lines that I drew. So I'm left with this kind of odd shape. I'm going to place it on here. I'm not actually going to keep this beak, but what it's doing now, it's helping me figure out where I want to place this on the black. And then I want to do the same thing with the wing. So I want to place this bird on my background, see what I think of it, how it's looking. I like the size of it. I like those colors. It's looking just like a chickadee. I want to add some gray tones into the wing. To create the bird's wing, I've traced the shape of the bird again, and I'm going to come in and draw just the wing. That triangular shape at the back is the tip of the wing. So I continue that line all the way around. And you can include the tail or not. You could draw a line on the other side of that triangular shape to just create a wing. And you may want to adjust the shape at the top of the wing, depending on the feather design of the bird you're working on. And now I'm going to cut out just the wing to place on my bird. So I added this sort of purpley gray color. That's going to be my wing. So now I want to stitch these 3 pieces onto this collage. Then I can hit it with an iron to erase these marks. I'm going to choose matching floss colors for the different areas of the bird's feathers. So I've gone around with my off-white, my gray, and my black, and I've attached this bird. So now I can come in with heat, and I'm going to erase those lines. So now I can stitch as little or as much as I like. I'm going to add this gray to the beak, and I'm going to put a French knot here for the eye of the bird. So I've added some stitching onto the body, and I still have to add it onto the wing. And I'm mindful of the fact that doing this heavy stitching in the center is going to pull everything in. It's going to distort the shape of this. That's often why it's a good idea to move back and forth between stitching heavily in one area and adding stitching around the edges as you go. And that's often a good way to go. With this piece, I decided that I wanted to get this part stitched well before moving on to doing stitching around. And so that's a valid choice too. And what it means is I have to be mindful and aware that that's going to change the shape of my piece. So if it's important to keep symmetrical edges, to keep everything perhaps like in this case in a square shape, then a better choice would be to move back and forth between stitching on the body and stitching in the background. You can see here that there's been some distortion that's happening. It's pulling in, so it's wider at the top. And that's okay for me now, as I don't have a particular plan about it being either symmetrical or a certain size. So now I'm going to continue with this stitching and add a couple of shades of gray for the wing. So I've begun stitching here on my wing, and I have used 2 different shades of gray, one slightly darker than the other. I'm continuing to use 2 strands of floss for all of my stitching. You could also go down to 1 strand if you wanted, if there was areas where you really wanted to vary the color. That's an option too. So I want to add some more grays in between the ones that are already there to add some variation. And I'm going to reference the photos I have of the black-capped chickadees to inform the direction and the colors I'm going to use for stitching. So here you can see I've added more stitching. I ended up deciding to stitch fairly heavily for the feathers of this bird. And I'm happy with the way that it's looking. So now I'm getting ready to stitch in the background. So I'm going to choose a few colors to have a choice in front of me as I stitch. I'm choosing a light blue for the top. I have 2 shades, a coral and a burgundy for that middle area. And I have a green for that bottom area. And I'm also going to bring in a lighter shade of green, and that will give me lots of options as I start to add stitching. I'm starting in the lower area with this darker green. I have 2 strands, and I'm choosing to stab stitch. And that's where I'm going from the front to the back and the back to the front. And I'm creating stitches vertically. And I'm going to vary the direction slightly as I stab stitch, but the general direction is going to be vertical. I'm going to move across this entire piece to hold it in place. And after I've gone across it, I can come back again and fill in some spots if I think it needs some more. So here are my first few stitches. It's starting to add some texture. I'm also going to stitch up in the blue area, and I'm going to change my direction and do horizontal stitches. I'm liking the way that that looks, and I'm going to continue with that blue, and I'm going to bring it down into that coral area. So I've used this light blue on top and I've brought it down, and I've used this darker color that's kind of a dark coral, and I'm starting to bring that down into the middle, and then I have that dark green on the bottom. And I'm thinking at this point that I really like having the simple stitching in the background because the chickadee is stitched so heavily. So I don't want to overdo my stitching. I don't want to compete with all that stitching on the chickadee. So I think I'm going to leave this background with lighter stitching. A question I get asked a lot is, what do I do with this stitched piece? And there are so many different things you can do. I'm bringing out my jean jacket. You can see on the back I've created an entire panel with slow stitching, and I'll link to the project where I created those pieces and connected them to the back panel of my jean jacket. I'm thinking about adding this chickadee to the front. You can see on the front I have a brooch here already with a butterfly on it, and I'll link to the project where I make these brooches. This brooch is secured with a safety pin, and I'm thinking that this chickadee might be nice in this area as well. Now, one option to connect this chickadee is to stitch it right on the jacket like I did in the back panel. So I'm placing it here, looking at my options for where to put it. I can follow the line of the jacket. I can also tilt it so that it's more up and down. And I'm liking the way that that looks, and that makes me think of a brooch. Now, this Chickadee is quite a bit bigger than the mini brooches that I made, but that doesn't mean that it can't be an artful brooch. And I'm going to pin this in place. I can hang this jacket up and have a look at it. I can also try it on and have a look at it and see what I think of that placement. Another place that I think that this would look really nice is beside the brooch that's already there. So part of that piece would be right under the collar of the jean jacket. Now again, I could stitch this right in place, but I like the idea of it being a brooch. So if this piece is going to be a brooch, there's a couple things I need to think about. I need to think about the edges, and I need to think about the backing. These pieces that I did previously had no backing because I sewed them directly on to my jacket. And that also took care of what to do with the edges because they were sewn on, and then other fabric was placed around it and sewn on as well. In terms of fastening this brooch on, I have these kilt pins. That size seems to fit quite well with the size of this stitched piece. I could use that to pin this right along the top, and I think that's a good idea. But before I do that, I would have to take care of the back. So to incorporate this kilt pin into this brooch, I could sew it along the top so it's visible. I could also just pin it on without sewing it on at all, and that's an option as well. I like the idea of sewing this kilt pin right on the front of the piece. So the one end is where the kilt pin opens, and the other end is the end that I would stitch right on the front. I could also use a larger safety pin and stitch that to the back, and then there'd be no pin visible. So that's a nice option also. But because I have this kilt pin, I want to use that today. So I've cut a piece of felt in this burgundy color, just slightly smaller than my piece, and that's going to be my backing. I'm using that darker color that I'd stitched on the front of the piece. I have 2 strands, and I'm going to stitch it in place. I want to make sure that I place it so that none of that felt is showing on the front. And I'm going to begin stitching at the top. And I want to leave some extra felt at the top. So I'm not going to stitch right on the edge. I'm going to start maybe about 1/4 of an inch down. So I've knotted my thread, starting on the right-hand side. And I'm going to stitch along that 1/4 inch from the top. I'm going to check the front to make sure I'm not stitching all the way through, so it's not showing on that blue fabric, but I'm making sure to grab the white felt that I'm stitching it to. So I'm going to stitch all the way across and fold back that top. I can see that I have some extra felt there. And then I'm going to turn and continue, and I'm going to stitch the rest of the felt. And I don't need to leave any extra, so I'm going to stitch right at the edge. I'm going to go back and forth between the white felt in the backing and this burgundy backing. Stitch everything together. So the 3 remaining sides will be stitched this way. Here I am coming to the end. I'm going to knot off. I'm going to take a few stitches back and forth to bury that thread, snip it off. And I'm going to bring in my kilt pin. I have that extra felt at the top. I could tuck the top of the kilt pin behind my fabric there so that that wouldn't be seen. That's one option. Or I could stitch it directly on the front. Either option is fine. I'm choosing a matching thread in that light blue. I'm coming from the back, and I'm going to stitch this directly on the front. I'm stab stitching, and I'm going over top of that bottom bar of the kilt pin, moving along and taking another stitch. I'm going to do that until I get to the very end. So I've made it across. You can see that my kilt pin can move a little bit, but it is secure. So I could knot off here, but I want to go back in the other direction. So I'm going to stitch in between the stitches I already made in the same way, work my way to the other side, There, my kilt pin is even more secure. And I'm going to turn to the back and I'm going to knot off. I'm going to take a couple of knots here and I'm going to go back and forth a few times underneath there with my thread so it's very secure, and snip it off. Oh, there's my kilt pin. I like the way that that looks. And now I'm ready to put it on my jacket. So I've opened up the pin. I'm going to choose my placement and get it exactly where I want it to be and pin it to my jacket. I'm going to adjust it, make sure that's where I want it, and I like that. I think that's looking great. So now that I'm happy with where it's placed, I'm going to look at the edges. They look unfinished to me, and I feel like I want to add more of a border. So I'm going to turn to one of my favorite ways to create a nice border, and that's the blanket stitch. I'm going to start with my green color. I'm going to start up at this right-hand corner and work my way around 3 sides of the piece. I'm going to leave the top without any stitching for now and see how I feel about the stitching on 3 sides. So I'm going to fold the ends of the fabric around to the back and hold them there with my finger as I start the blanket stitch. I keep my thread to the side with my left hand while I take the stitches, and that way when I come up I'm making a loop and forming that stitch. So I'm working my way down that side, and I'm going to continue all the way around until I get to the top left. So here I'm taking my last stitch, and here's what the blanket stitch looks like. I haven't stitched across the top, and I like the way that it looks on those 3 sides. It's creating a nice border and it's pulling in the edges of that fabric. So now I'm going to do another round of blanket stitch. This time I'm going to use my dark coral color. So here I am. I've worked my way down one side and part of the other, and I'm going to continue that all the way up to the top left. So I like how this has cleaned up the edges. It's confined the shape of it. Now I can look at the top of this and decide if I want to leave this raw or if I want to do the same treatment here or something different. I think the first thing I'm going to do is bring out that light blue floss and do some more stitching in that upper area. It's looking a little bare to me, and I want to fill that in a bit. So I added a few more blue stitches up here. So that's not a visual distraction for me. And now I want to bring this same feeling of being pulled in, this feeling of completion to the top. So I'm going to bring in this green that's in the bottom that I've stitched along the edges. And I'm going to bring it along the top. I'm not going to do a blanket stitch because I want those frayed edges to stay at the top because I like the way that that looks. I want to complete this look of a frame and add it to the top as well, so it's not just on the 3 sides. So I'm stab stitching vertically. So this is going to look visually the same as the blanket stitch, while not being a blanket stitch, because a blanket stitch would start to fold down these frayed edges. So I've worked my way across with this stab stitch, and now I'm going to do the same thing with this dark coral color. So I've come across in the other direction with the coral in between those stitches. I like the way that looks, so I'm going to knot off now. And there across the top, I've created a visual border with those straight vertical stitches that really match the blanket stitching I've done on the edges. So now I'm going to get out my jean jacket again, and I'm going to attach this into the same spot I had it before. I'll be able to find the holes in the fabric that I'd made before, and I can slip them in there, and there's my brooch. I really think it was worth the extra step of doing that blanket stitching on the edges. It's pulled everything together. It's a much cleaner look, and it looks really nice beside the other brooch that also has blanket stitching. I'm really happy with the way this has turned out. And I think it looks really good on my jean jacket, and there's still room for me to add more. Thank you so much for joining me as I created this brooch. Keep in mind that the order of operations for creating this can change. I could have blanket stitched around the edges first, then add a backing, and then add my kilt pin. Any way that feels right to you is fine. I hope this has inspired you to create your own stitched chickadee. Until next time, happy stitching.